This book is full of shit, and I'm excited to talk about it. And hopefully, so are you. Cheers. Welcome back, everybody, to me talking about books, and today we'll be talking about one specific book I'm excited to talk about, and that is Consider Phlebas, book 1 of the Culture series by Iain M. Banks, that, I promised to talk about a while ago when I was asking for some help with, working out through my debts and shit like that. Thanks everyone who actually supported me there. If you want to support me still, there's links down below, but as I said, I promised to do a read-along through the entire 10 volumes of The Culture. Well, it's 9 volumes plus a short story collection of The Culture series by Iain M. Banks, and after our first discussion on the Discord server last week, it's finally time to actually have a video about Consider Phlebas from 1987. The next book up in the series is The Player of Games. If you want to join the conversation, there's a link down in the description. You can join the Unabridged Burners Discord, and we'll talk about The Player of Games there. We'll have about a month, I guess, to read the book, and then have a conversation in a voice chat with everyone who's interested to talk about it, and then there will be a video. For those of you new to this, we'll follow the model that I use for my Discworld novels, which is I'll give a quick synopsis, trigger warnings, all of that stuff, why you should go and read it, and then I'll go into the spoiler-filled terrain when we talk about why I think this book is so powerful, good, and all the other positive things that I can say about it, or possibly also some of the issues that may be in this book if it's not a perfect 10 out of 10. Yeah, that's what we'll do, and we'll start about now. Consider Phlebas was published in 1987. It's the first published culture novel by Iain M. Banks, not the first one he wrote about it. Some of them got, rewritten and published later. Markedly, A Use of Weapons, which is apparently the first one he tried to write. We'll talk about those in due course. It is an interesting choice for a first culture novel because it mostly does not take place within the culture, but looks at the culture, and we'll talk about what that is later on, from the outside, through the eyes of one Bora Horza Gobachul, who is doing a mission, a special mission for another alien species that is at war with the culture, and he is trying to find something, and we follow him and his attempts of getting to a planet and doing the things. It's a long-ish heist story, mostly, with different episodes that are almost, short stories or novellas in themselves, introducing us to the universe of the culture and giving us a good look around. It's fun. It's fairly easy to read, I think. I really enjoy it. It showcases a lot of the things that make later culture novels also great and are, hallmarks of Iain M. Banks' style. There's humor there, the conversations between drones or artificial intelligences in general and humans. All of that stuff is in there, but this one is also rather brutal and rather raw, and this is where we talk about trigger warnings, content warnings, because if you haven't read the book yet, there is at least one very specific scene in there that is rather gross and involves cannibalism and stuff like that. And if you don't like those kind of things, you probably shouldn't read this book, or at least skip a chapter called The Eaters. That out of the way, go read the book. It's a classic for a reason, and people who think it's not a good introduction to the Culture series are wrong. It's actually a really good one. So I don't know, go get the book, read the book, have fun, and let's talk about more spoilery stuff now. Alright, so I assume that you have either read the book or don't care about spoilers, so here we are. What do I think it makes this book interesting and so forth? We'll talk a bit about the structure, then we'll talk about the idea of looking at the culture from the outside, giving us that outside perspective. We'll look a bit at humor and all those things, and then we'll come to why I think there is a powerful statement in this novel that may feel rather, poignant at the moment, and that is a statement about war. What is it good for? That kind of thing. All right, so let's look at the structure. And I think there's something interesting with the structure. I already said it is obviously a book written from the outside. We follow the Changer Horza as he works for the Idiran army, those tripod people, basically. And, trying to defeat the culture because he believes the culture is wrong. It's anti-life because it's all about AI. And yeah, those terminologies have certainly gone through some changes since the late 80s, so there's interesting stuff to get there. I think it's an interesting approach to take here, to look at the culture from the outside, because it allows Banks, who clearly likes the culture as a model for society, with its great freedom, individual freedom, almost an level of anarchy, basically, in its post-scarcity situation. He does clearly like the culture, but he is aware of the fact that you can level certain criticisms against that model of society. So starting from the outside with someone opposed to that model of how to run a society, I think is an admirable approach, because it allows him to go through these criticisms before showing us all the good things the culture can do. Sometimes he does so in later novels. So yeah, having the culture more as an enemy than the actual good side in this conflict, I think, well, not in this conflict, but in this novel, I think is an interesting approach, but one that may throw some people off that expect this to be about the culture by, having characters from inside the culture, which is, of course, another problem with a series of novels that are labeled as the culture, but, are all sort of standalone novels, and in that way, very different from what we might see in your epic fantasy sagas, basically. So there's that. And then the novel itself, I think, is a series of heists, and all of these fail. This, once again, I think is an interesting approach, right? Every time Horza does something, these missions all go wrong in spectacular or less spectacular ways, because of humans being humans, or just plain bad luck, or people being too fanatic, and so forth. And this, once again, I think is structurally interesting, because compared to a lot of books where our characters undergo what you might call a hero's journey or any form of that stuff, and they become better and stronger and succeed at the end and overcome adversity. Not in this book. People constantly fail in this book, and I find that interesting. It adds to that level of absurdity that I think is inherent in this novel and in the themes of this novel. There's a level of absurdity there that I think that I quite appreciate. But yeah, we have the whole setup in the beginning. We will talk about the humor and the execution cell there in a moment. Then we have Horza becoming a part of Craiglin's gang, and the spectacular attack on the Temple of Light, which I really enjoy as a set piece. We then have the whole disaster on the Vawach orbital, the bit about the Eaters. All of these are not exactly about success. Then we have the card game scene. We'll come back to that later on as well. But all of these are sort of almost closed off individual stories that kind of come together through the idea that there is an actual story, that there's an actual mission for Horza to do, which is, go to the planet and to the planet of the dead and find the culture mind. But they're all individual, and they kind of stack, because the stakes kind of rise, but people still constantly fail at them. And then it obviously all ends up with the whole part in the command center of the planet, in the command system of the planet, and the ultimate failure and death of just about everyone except the culture agent Balveda. And yeah, as I said, individual stories that I think all work as more or less as individual stories, and just look at how fanaticism leads to bad places. So let's look at absurdity first. And there is a level of humor here. There's two forms of humor in E.M. Banks' novels. In this one, we have, on the one hand, we have the absurdity, and then we have the more comedic stuff that comes from conversations between humans and drones. E.M. Banks has a very unique way of writing AI characters who are, on the whole, in this one at least, more human than the human characters. So there's that. And that's certainly fun, especially with the repair drone Unahar Clasp and its conversations with Horza and the others. There's a lot of just fun in there, but there's another layer of comedy here, and I think that's the darker humor, the absurdist humor of starting off with our character literally being drowned in shit. Now, there's obviously other authors have done a similar thing. We can think, for example, of The Bone Hunters by Stephen Erickson, where everyone's favorite Karsa Orlong has to endure a more smelly combat environment for a moment. Anyway, my point is, that's a statement. Have our main character, or a point of view character at least, and possibly hero, drown in shit as an opening scene. That's powerful in an absurdist way. And there's layers of that you can find possibly some form of humor in part of what happens in the Eater scene. We'll come back to that Eater scene later as well. And then, of course, during the damage game, which I think shows something that we can see. Iain Banks is aware of the larger field of science fiction, and he's not afraid to use and subvert and change and add and so forth its influences. And one influence that I think is very visible, especially in the Game of Damage subchapter with the whole setup, the card game and everything, is the influence of Douglas Adams. Now, Douglas Adams's Hitchhiker's Guide Through the Galaxy series, while turning really dark near the end, starts up with a lot of absurdist humor and jokes and just crazy, willful, everything basically. It's hard to describe, but it's the universe of the Hitchhiker's Guide Through the Galaxy is absurd, and it's full of stuff and surprises, and everything is possible within that universe. And in a way, that also goes for the universe of the culture, but it's a less positive way. It's still, the absurdism is still there, but there's a layer of darkness there, a layer of death that is not as prevalent in at least the early Hitchhiker's Guide books by Douglas Adams. But I think it's a clear influence, especially with that card game scene. It feels very Hitchhiker's Guide or Restaurant at the End of the Universe like in a lot of ways, and I do appreciate that. So there's these two forms of humor: the absurdist humor, often getting into the almost like shock humor or just generally shock value of gross and disgusting descriptions on the one hand, and then we have the more like comedic duo conversation kind of thing between drones and humans that we also see in this book. And I think both work. I personally am still grossed out by the Eaters chapter. The shock value there is obviously there. It's a matter of taste. I feel how much you like or dislike that chapter. I can certainly see it being the one that makes or breaks the novel for a lot of people. But I think it also does something else, and that is something that I think this book in general tackles. There's two themes here, I think, that we need to talk about before we end this. That first theme is the conversation between fundamentalism on the one hand and liberal society, or almost libertarianism, or whatever you want to call it, on the other hand. See, the conflict between the Idirans and the culture is exactly that. You have religious fundamentalists, they're basically fascists, religious fascists, that want to conquer the entire universe, because that's the only way they can see, make sense of the universe and their place in it in a lot of ways. And that means that society is rigidly structured. Everyone has their place, everyone knows their place, and everyone does what they are told, basically. It's not a liberal society. Whereas the culture, and we constantly get told that through Horza's eyes, and through Horza's mind, mostly, the culture allows just about everything. There is no or very little coercion within society. And with the Eaters chapter, that one is clear, because the shuttle actually is on the island of the Eaters, but it is not intervening. It is not doing anything. It lets humans do these things, and that is that larger conversation about liberalism. Is like how free is freedom when it also leads to actual harm, and we see the culture taking an extreme stance there. And yeah, Banks is willing to showcase those extreme negative sides of it as well. It's like, yeah, this is a religious cult that is about cannibalism and exploiting people. But if those people joined that group voluntarily, who is society to tell them otherwise? Well, I personally have strong opinions on the matter, but I think it's an interesting way of showcasing this between this like conversation, this larger conversation about freedom and order that is playing out in this story. But there's of course more to that. And that is Horsa's insistence that his version is about life, and the other one by accepting artificial intelligence and computers to guide society for benefit and so forth, have sort of given up their like primacy of organic life, basically. And I think it's an interesting thing to see there, because we can see how someone who believes that is attracted to a religious fundamentalist fascist ideology as the one of the adherents, which at the end of the day will not actually help that individual, as we find out at the end when Horsa has to fight against the adherents, basically, because he's not seen as the top of that adherent society, because he's not an adherent, he's a human at the end of the day. But we can see that attraction of a certain form of religious fundamentalism to people who are oftentimes uncertain about their own background, about their own position in the world, having a society that tells them where, or having a group that tells them, an ideology that tells them where they belong and what to do. That it can be attractive. And on the other hand, seeing a modern liberal society in which everything is possible and pleasure is seen as a virtue, and seeking of pleasure is seen as a good thing, religious fascists have issues with that. And while this is obviously in space, and we have aliens with 3 feet, 3 legs, and stuff like that going on, that conversation is a very real one in our world. I don't have to tell you that, right? Religious fundamentalists having strong opinions about people enjoying sex, about people having fun, and seeing that as the goal of life, to enjoy life. That's around, and I think through the character of Horsa, who is very insecure in his own existence, the question of whether he is in fact fully alive and fully human, because he may be, or he is the result of genetic manipulation, as the whole group of changers are, finding a place within that rigid hierarchy, and then fighting against a liberal society, because he's basically fighting against a part of himself. That's very real in our world as well, and I think that's one of the strengths of this book that kind of lie under a lot of the just hijinks of having laser battles in crystal temples and shit like that, having that deeper and darker meaning below it, and that I think is great, because the next part, I think, is what makes Consider Phlebas such a powerful novel. Because while this is, on the face of it, the conflict between a liberal society and a fascist society, a rigidly structured religious fundamentalist society, it doesn't really matter that much. And the events that seem so meaningful to people like Horsa, in the larger scope of things, just don't matter. And I think that is sort of the ending of the story, right? When Banks zooms out and gives a quick summary of the whole war and all of these things, like, all the things we've just read, all the fights, all the people suffering for no reason, all the people dying because of really stupid reasons, all of it really doesn't matter, because it maybe has prolonged or shortens the war by a couple of weeks, and that's it. And even within the larger even the larger war, with its billions of people dying, is not a huge occurrence in the gigantic size of the universe. And I think that is at the core of a lot of what Banks does over time. Is the universe is gigantic. Species in it are well, then we don't matter, no matter how powerful a species we are in the greater context of a galactic size scale. Yeah, it's all basically meaningless. So why even do it? And I think that's sort of what will come in the future books, culture novels, is the idea that we need to make meaning for ourselves. We need to create meaning, and it is that meaning that we create for ourselves that keeps us from, just giving up at the sheer scale of an uncaring universe. We don't fall into a Lovecraftian cosmic horror because we create meaning for ourselves. And that's the positive side of the culture, is the idea of creating meaning. And when it comes to meaning, freedom from pain and the seeking of pleasure and enjoyment are pretty good goals when it comes to just, figuring out what to do despite everything being this large. And that, I think, is what, Consider Phlebas comes down to. It's a story, it's a fun adventure story with a lot of darkness, a lot of violence, a lot of absurdism, because people are doing terribly stupid things. There's a general sense of meaninglessness, of absurd meaninglessness in the face of everything. And the question of what to do in that case, and the answer is create meaning for ourselves. Go mountain climbing or do other things that make us happy. And that is, unfortunately or fortunately, only possible within a liberal society, a free society where we can all find meaning for ourselves and no one else is telling us these things. And that, is pretty good for a book, I think. So yeah, that's my thoughts on Consider Phlebas. It's a tough book to wrestle with in a lot of ways, and I understand why people think Player of Games may sometimes be a easier introduction, because it has a much easier to follow a narrative progression and so forth. But I think it makes sense to start with Consider Phlebas because life's messy, the universe is messy. Why should books be otherwise, right? So yeah, these are my thoughts. Let me know what you think about Consider Phlebas. Have you read it? Do you want to read it? Do you think it's a good place to start? Let me hear your thoughts down in the comments. I love to argue with you, as always. If you want to support me, there's liking, subscribing, all of these things, and there's some links down below if you feel like, giving me money, which I certainly can use. Anyway, have a great Sunday evening, and I'll talk to you very soon about something else. Thanks, and cheers.